Excuse me, may we start? I think it's a time to start. If I may kindly ask to take a seat. Thank you. It always works. That's a very Dionysian way of awakening. Dionysian way of awakening public. We are in a session 3 with first lecture. I invite my friend Filip Doroszewski, who is an assistant professor of classical philology at Cardinal Stefan Wyszyński University in Warsaw. His research interests focus on religion and literature, especially on the Roman and early Christian reception of Dionysus, and today he will give us a lecture on the titled State as Crater, Dionysiac motifs in Plutarch lives of Crassus, Antony, and Caesar. Please, Filip, start.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I hope that you have my handout in front of you. You don't? Well, Dionysiac imagery occupies an important place in Plutarch's writings. For Plutarch, Dionysus represents a force that can be very dangerous, but at the same time, that can be most beneficial too, if only properly curbed and canalized. On a general level, Dionysus symbolizes changes the universe undergoes on a regular basis. These changes always lead to re-establishing the order of the universe. This is so because Dionysus is just an aspect of the divine power governing the world. Another powerful aspect of this divinity is Apollo, who represents stability. Variability and stability are in fact two facets of the same process. Their right combination allows the university to exist. Dionysus is also important for human communities. If Dionysus's violent side is tamed, he helps to develop friendship, philia, among people. And philia, needless to say, is one of the key terms in Greek political thinking. I just summarized items 1 and 2 on my handout. There is no need to read them now. Plutarch likes a lot the passage of Plato's laws that compares a well-governed state to a crater in which the wine is properly mixed with water. This is number 3 on my handout. People do not find it easy to perceive that a state should be like a bowl of mixed wine, where the wine, when first poured in, foams madly, but as soon as it is chastened by another sober deity, it forms a fair alliance and produces a potion that is good and moderate. In his writings, Plutarch directly quotes this passage 3 times, but hints at it a couple of times more. Each time the context is political, sensu largo. Also, each time the quotation or allusion is enriched with strong Dionysiac overtones. The first instance is number 4. Not even Lycurgus, the mighty son of Darius, had sound sense, because when many became drunk and violent, he went about uprooting the grapevines instead of bringing the springs of water nearer, and thus chastening the frenzied god, as Plato says, through correction by another, a sober god. Importantly, Plutarch modifies Plato's words in a slight but significant way. While Plato has mainomenos oinos, mead wine, Plutarch speaks about mainomenos theos, mead God, thus clearly interpreting Plato's wine as the Dionysiac element in the state. The message is unambiguous. The state needs the Dionysiac, although it must be kept under control, as Plutarch emphasizes by adding the word sophronizo to make moderate. Another passage in which Plutarch quotes Plato carries a similar message. This is number 5. I'm just summarizing it. This time, it's about the role the old men should play in the state. Their active participation in governing the polis can be a sobering counterbalance to the violent actions taken by the youth. Once again, Plato's mead and wine is replaced with mainomenos theos, mead and God. Additionally, some more Dionysiac imagery is used here too. The way the youth behave is compared to the Bacchic frenzy by means of words Baccheuo and mania. Bacchic frenzy that can be potentially dangerous to the state and needs to be balanced with other means. The last of the direct quotations preserved in a fragment mentioned by Stobaeus at the bottom of number 5 sounds almost the same. It advises young people to follow the example of the old. Here too, the quotation reads mainomenos theos instead of mainomenos oinos. To sum up, for Plutarch, the Dionysiac, even if dangerous in a pure form, is an indispensable part of the state. The example of Lycurgus shows clearly that without the mead god, the state falls apart. By contrast, if accepted in a moderated form, Dionysus builds up the political community and allows the opposites to coexist. Now, one may ask, what does it all have to do with the 3 lives mentioned in the title of my talk? Well, as we have seen, the Dionysiac is an important category Plutarch uses to make sense of the political life. And Plutarch's lives are the biographies of politicians. No surprise, at closer look, the 3 lives I'm discussing in this paper are rich in Dionysiac imagery. This raises a legitimate question about its function. As observed by Christopher Pelling, the 3 texts belong to a group of 6 late Roman lives prepared by Plutarch simultaneously as a separate and consistent project. This makes it tempting to look at the Dionysiac imagery occurring in the 3 lives as yet another element contributing to the consistency of this group. In a present paper, I will argue that the Dionysiac motifs in Crassus, Antony, and Caesar play a significant role in portraying 3 different types of statesmanship. I'm starting by discussing Crassus. David Brown and Aleksiej Zadorozhny have convincingly shown that Euripides' Bacchi is the most important intertext for Plutarch's Crassus, at least for its longest part, which is Crassus's campaign against Parthia. They pointed out many parallels between the two narratives. The most important parallel occurs at the end of the life. When Parthians defeat the Roman army, they kill Crassus and send off his head to their king. When the head reaches the king, he is just watching Euripides' Bacchus. This is number 6. This is item 6. Now, when the head of Crassus was brought to the king's door, a tragic actor, Jason by name, of Tralles, was singing that part of the Bacchus of Euripides where Agawi is about to appear. While he was receiving his applause, Sillacus stood at the door of the banqueting hall and, after a low obeisance, cast the head of Crassus into the center of the company. Then Jason handed the mask of Pentheus to one of the chorus, seized the head of Crassus, and in a Bacchic frenzy and inspiration sang these verses through. We bring from the mountain a tendril fresh cut to the palace, a wonderful prey. This delighted everybody. With such a catastrophe as this, the expedition of Crassus is said to have closed, just like a tragedy. Crassus's head replaces Pentheus's head in the hands of Agawi. Thus, Plutarch provides the reader with an interpretative key to the story of the Parthian campaign. Why exactly Crassus is being compared here to Pentheus? Crassus is not a negative hero throughout the whole life. At first, he is depicted by Plutarch as a talented politician and a successful general, even if too money-grabbing. To use Professor Seaford terminology, he enjoys a lot the culture of the unlimited. He likes money. So, but when elected for consulship for the second time, Crassus undergoes a sudden change. This is number 7 on my handouts. Among strangers and in public, he could scarcely hold his peace, while to his intimates he made many empty and youthful boasts which ill became his years and his disposition. For he had been anything but boastful or bombastic before this. But now, being altogether exalted and out of his senses, he would not consider Syria, nor even Parthia, as the boundaries of his success, but thought to make the campaigns of Lucullus against Tigranes and those of Pompey against Mithridates seem mere child's play, and flew on the wings of his hopes as far as Bactria and India and the outer sea. Crassus is now so conceited and hybristic that he loses touch with reality. He makes grandiose plans to conquer India and to reach the outer ocean. This is, of course, an allusion to Alexander the Great, but at the same time to Dionysus' Indian campaign. As elsewhere in his writings, Plutarch repeats many times that Alexander wished to emulate Dionysus. Thus, in his pride, Crassus challenges Dionysus himself, which chimes well with the tragic fate of his head. This is a fact that, in my opinion, hasn't been noticed so far. While making his far-fetched military plans, Crassus no longer cares about his community. He sets for his Parthian campaign against the will of the Roman people, From that moment on, Crassus is more and more similar to Pentheus. He keeps ignoring the divine warnings, pays no attention to the good advice of his friends, while himself is being deceived by his false friends. When Crassus meets the Parthian army, the army plays timpana and wears skins and long robes. Surena, the Parthian general, looks effeminate, but at the same time is a formidable warrior. The sequence of parallels with Euripides does not stop with Crassus's death. Right after it, the Parthians organize a mocking triumph in which they lead Crassus's double, dressed as a woman. Finally, Crassus's head is brought on stage instead of Pentheus's mask. Because of his stubbornness and excessive pride, Crassus's campaign, as Plutarch says, ends in an inglorious death and public calamities, end of quote. Crassus's blindness, just like that of Pentheus, makes the whole community suffer. In order to portray this type of statesmanship, Plutarch depicts Crassus as a Roman Pentheus, an enemy of the Dionysiac, the force which, as we have seen, Plutarch understands as a necessary for striking the balance in the state. If we recur to the metaphor of the state as crater, we may say that Crassus's mixing bowl is filled up with water only. Unlike Crassus, Antony cannot be called an enemy of the Dionysiac. Antony likes surrounding himself with actors, the technitai of Dionysus, and musicians. He loves spending time at theatrical shows and all-night drinking parties. He is a womanizer too. Moreover, at some point of his career, Antony himself starts posing as Dionysus. His entry to Ephesus, mentioned before by Professor Seaford, is carefully staged as Dionysiac procession with all its distinctive features. Women dressed like bacchantes, boys like satyrs and pants, Dionysiac music, Thyrsi, etc., etc. Additionally, when his relationship with Cleopatra begins, they present themselves as a pair of deities, Dionysus and Aphrodite. Plutarch qualifies Cleopatra as true femme fatale. Antony's love for her is called the ultimate evil, teleutaion kakon. This is number 8. Now, as a crowning evil, his love for Cleopatra supervened, roused, and drove to frenzy many of the passions that were still hidden and quiescent in him, and dissipated and destroyed whatever good and saving qualities still offered resistance. This is not by chance that Plutarch uses the word anabacheuo, drive into Bacchic frenzy, to describe Cleopatra's destructive influence on Antony. Antony's Dionysiac pose takes absolute control over his personality. When the war between Antony and the young Octavian is about to begin, there comes a series of omens. One of them is particularly significant in the context of Antony's identification with Dionysus. This is item 9 on my handout. At Athens, the Dionysus in the Battle of Giants was dislodged by the winds and carried down into the theater. Now, Antony associated himself with Dionysus in the mode of life which he adopted, and he was called the new Dionysus. Well, Plutarch means that this is very significant. This is a presage of things to come. On the last night of the war, when Antony and Cleopatra are besieged in Alexandria by Octavian's forces, a sudden epiphany of Dionysus takes place. The god manifests himself with his melodious Thiasos in the middle of Alexandria and subsequently leaves. the city. As Plutarch says, this is number 10, those who saw the meaning of the sign were of the opinion that the god to whom Antony always most likened and attached himself was now deserting him. As you may remember, the Dionysiac is for Plutarch a force that can be accepted only in a moderated form, otherwise proves counterproductive, not to say destructive. No doubt, Antony is a leader who wants to replace daily existence with a Bacchic revelry. His recipe for the ideal state is a crater filled with the wine only. But this simply cannot be done. In the end, Antony, the new Dionysus, turns out to be just a false Dionysus, deluded and abandoned by the true one. The Dionysiac imagery in both Crassus and Antony has attracted a lot of attention from scholars. By contrast, the Dionysiac motifs in Plutarch's Caesar has been largely ignored, in my opinion. Unlike in the two previous works, in which Plutarch uses the motifs to tell a story of lack of balance, the Dionysiac references in Caesar contribute to the positive image of the protagonist. The most important Dionysiac theme, hidden between the lines of the life, is the Orphic myth of Dionysus, the myth in which Dionysus is enthroned by Zeus as the new ruler of the world, but is torn apart by the Titans before he can rule. The first scene, in which the myth is very clearly alluded to, tells about the feast of Bona Dea, or good goddess. The feast is held in Caesar's house by his wife and mother. This is item 11 on my handout. The Romans have a goddess whom they call the good goddess. The Greeks regard her as one of the mothers of Dionysus, the one it is forbidden to name. That is the origin of the custom of covering the tents with vine branches during the festival, and a sacred snake sits by the goddess, just as the myth says. No man is allowed to come to the festival. The women are left by themselves, and it is said that many of their rites are similar to Orphic ritual. Although it may seem that Plutarch is not sure who Bona Dea actually is, in fact, he knows it very well. The mother of Dionysus, it is forbidden to name, ten arreton, is of course Persephone, whom Euripides calls arretoscore. According to the Orphic tradition, Persephone was raped by her father Zeus in the shape of a serpent. Dionysus was conceived through this act of incest. This is why Plutarch mentions a sacred snake as well as the myth, ton mython, which is of course the Orphic myth. This is further confirmed by the similarity of the Bona Dea rites to Orphic ritual emphasized by Plutarch. In Plutarch's eyes, Caesar was a suitable candidate for ruling Rome. Even more, Plutarch is ready to admit that Caesar was given this particular role by divine providence. This is number 12. Caesar's rule caused some considerable trouble for its opponents while it was being established. But once people had accepted it and been defeated, it seemed no more than a name and a semblance, with no consequences that were cruel or tyrannical. Indeed, it seemed as if the circumstances were calling for monarchy, and Caesar was heaven's own gift to Rome as the gentlest possible doctor. In this light, it is hardly accidental that Plutarch alludes to the Orphic myth of Dionysus, the ruler of the world, while narrating the story of the Bonadea feast held in Caesar's house. We should rather think that in this way, Plutarch wants to draw a parallel between the fates of the Orphic Dionysus and Caesar. Another scene in which the Orphic myth may be hinted at is crossing the Rubicon. Caesar feels greatly distressed. On the night before the crossing, he has a disturbing dream, number 13. It is said that the night before he crossed, he dreamed a monstrous dream. It seemed to him that he was lying with his own mother, the Unspeakable Union. In modern scholarship, the dream is most commonly interpreted as a symbol of Caesar's aggression against the Republic. But, as you may remember, this is not the first time when the word arretos, unspeakable, occurs in this life. Previously, it was referred to Persephone. This invites us to understand the term meixis or mixis, not just as sexual intercourse in general, but rather as a very particular kind of sexual intercourse, namely the so-called divine rape. Such rape, says Aphrodisia Vagiano in her book Sacred Marriage, was called by the Greek mixis, and it stands in polarity to the traditionally regarded divine marriage of Zeus and Hera. The divine rape is a strange sexual union under a zoomorphic form. It is always connected with mysteries and, in contrast to the divine marriage, never depicted in art. Needless to say, this is exactly the case of Persephone, raped by Zeus, who took the form of a serpent. Taking this into account, it is tempting to interpret Caesar's dream and the expression ten arreton meixin as yet another reference to the Orphic myth of Dionysus, and at the same time to Caesar's predestined role of ruling over Rome as a sole master. The last passage I would like to talk about is the scene of Caesar's violent death, number 14. Caesar was surrounded. He was run through like some wild beast, rolling to and fro in everyone's hands. For each person there needed to begin the sacrifice and taste of the slaughter. He fell by the pedestal on which Pompey's statue stood, still, how can I read this word? Writhing, thank you. Writhing convulsively from his many wounds. There were 23 of these. The scene is rich in sacrificial imagery. The conspirators are like sacrificial priests. Caesar like sacrificial animal. There is even an altar-like pedestal of the statue. Caesar is ritually mutilated, his body ritually disfigured. Importantly, each of the attackers has an equal share in this perverted sacrifice, or, as Plutarch says, in tasting of the slaughter, geusast hai tu phonu. The combination of geuo, to taste, and phonos, slaughter, occurs only twice elsewhere in Plutarch. Not surprisingly, one of the two instances can be found in a passage in which Plutarch mentions the story of Dionysus Zagreus, torn to pieces by the Titans. This is number 15. The stories told about the sufferings and dismemberment of Dionysus and the outrageous assaults of the Titans upon him, and their punishment and blasting by thunderbolt after they had tasted his blood, Geusamenon to Phonu. All this is a myth which in its inner meaning has to do with rebirth. Is it just a coincidence? I don't think so. I think that Plutarch is making here a clear allusion to the death suffered in the Orphic myth by Dionysus himself, death by a ritual called sparagmos. As seen by Plutarch, Caesar is neither a tyrant, hostile to the Dionysiac, like Crassus, nor tries to be a new Dionysus, like Antony. Although regarded by some as a tyrant, in the end, Caesar turns out to be the gentlest possible doctor. The Dionysiac imagery used by Plutarch in the life strengthens this positive image and presents Caesar as the one who was really able to put an end to the political instability and turmoil of the late Republic. Or, in other words, who could fill the crater of Rome with the proper mixture of water and wine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Filip, for a brilliant paper. Please stay with us for a discussion. It's always a striking thing about the integrity of ancient world when you listen that parts were passing time enjoying Euripides, the barbarians who are watching Euripides, who we are from that point of view. And the second thing is, I think that that's a very striking evidence, because we all know that Bach were often used because of usage in the school of a text of Euripides, was a kind of a façon de parler of ancient writers, and the allusions are widespread. But I think that Filip showed us that it's definitely something more, that we have an example of political theology, or the concept of political reality, which is based on the model of Dionysian myth as a paradigm of a successful and unsuccessful politician. What's much deeper than I've ever heard on Plutarch, the use of Euripides and Dionysus. So thank you very much, and I open discussion. Please, if anyone, yes, Fiachra.
Given that in the, first of all, thank you for a wonderful paper, and I'm really interested in the Caesar material because it seems very original. Given that Plutarch was very capable of and interested in using Dionysian metaphorics explicitly, why do you think that he didn't make it more explicit in the case of the material that you have shown us from Caesar?
Well, in fact, what I presented was just a selection of the Dionysiac passages from the life of Caesar. And of course, there is much more of them. I mean, there is more passages in which even the name of Dionysus is mentioned. But I decided to focus exclusively on the myth of this on this Orphic myth of Dionysus, because I think that politically this is the most important Dionysiac motif in this life. But for example, when Caesar is on his way to Pharsalos with his army, so for example they capture a city which is called Gomphi, and well, his army is very tired, is ill, and they capture this city, and the city is full of wine, and they drink a lot of wine, and then they are, like, you know, completely renewed. And Plutarch says that they form a komos, and a Bacchic komos, and they go farther. So, you know, this also may be interpreted as a sign that Dionysus is on his side, so to say.
That's very like what we get in the stories about Alexander in Carmania.
Yes.
So sort of a proleptic triumph, if you like.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you for this great paper. I would like to go to the last example, when Plutarch apparently relates Sagrus to Caesar. You didn't comment this last sentence, no? This is a myth which, in its inner meaning, has to do with rebirth. This is very interesting, because
I think so. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah,
in the context of.
In the political way, I mean, because when he parallels Caesar and Sagrus, maybe he's referring to the perpetuation of the political role of Caesar, which is great. And I would like to compare that with another passage you then quote from, very famous one from Antony's life, the abandonment of Dionysus, no, before he commits suicide, no. Yeah. This line, wonderful lines that inspired. Cavafis, no? Apollipint Theos Antony.
Of course.
Dionysus,
I mentioned this passage.
Politically, he's dead because Dionysus is not with him. I don't know. Can you develop this?
In fact, I wanted to say something about it, but I decided to skip it because of lack of time. But this famous scene when Dionysus leaves Alexandria, leaving Antony, deserting Antony, Plutarch says that when he's leaving the city, he's going towards the camp of Octavian. So Augustus. Well, Octavian at that time. So we know well that Octavian was he was an adopted son of Caesar. So if there is a motif of rebirth in here, we can easily say who is reborn Dionysus, who is next reborn Dionysus. It probably Plutarch wants to say that that even if Caesar failed, Augustus is the one who continues this Dionysiac path. I think so.
I'm sorry, our time is very short, so if you would like to ask a question, please, last question. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Filip, again. We are at home because you've mentioned Augustus, and Fiachra Góráin is going to deliver us the paper on Augustus and the Neoi Dionysoi. So we came exactly to the point when Filip finished that very story. Fiachra Góráin is an associate professor of classics in the University in a UCL, and he studied at Trinity College in Oxford, and he's author of several articles on Virgil and co-editor of Forthcoming, We Are Waiting, Cambridge Companion to Virgil. So It put some light on probably August and Virgil relation. Thank you.
I'll stand over there.
Have we distributed the handouts? Do you have handouts? No?
This one here, right? Yeah. And this is the thing, is it? Yeah. Thank you very much, Dariusz, for your introduction. Yes. Is that on now? Yes. Okay. Fine. Thank you, Dariusz, for your introduction, and thank you to Filip for the wonderful, for the invitation, and also for the wonderful hospitality, which I'm very much enjoying on my first visit to Poland. So, in the first passage that is on your handout, Anchises famously compares the imperial conquests of Augustus to those of Hercules and Bacchus. The obvious meaning of the comparison is that Augustus will traverse and civilize even greater territories than Hercules and Bacchus, both culture heroes who impose order upon savagery, and both figures for global conquest. In an influential article from 1899, Edward Norden illuminated these lines against a background of panegyric on Alexander. Even though these texts don't survive, they may be reconstructed from the references to them that we do have in rhetorical sources such as Menander Rhetor. The connection between Dionysus and Alexander may be traced back either to Alexander's own lifetime, as some scholars think, or to the first generation after the death of Alexander. I'm interested in probing what work this reference to Dionysus is doing for Anchises and for Virgil at this point of the Aeneid, and also what broader function and alignment of Dionysus and Augustus could have. The inquiry is made much more interesting by the material that Filip has just been talking about, namely the self-styled identification of Mark Antony with Dionysus. Some scholars have argued hard that Augustus managed not only to neutralize Antony's connection with Dionysus, and the word divestment is frequently used in that context, but also to create a link between himself and Dionysus. Other scholars are resistant to this view. A strong argument against it is that Augustus did not restore the temple of Ceres Liber and Libera on the Aventine, which was destroyed by fire in the same year as the Battle of Actium. Its restoration was not completed until the reign of Tiberius, so this means that Augustus left it in a state of disrepair during his entire reign. Despite this, scholars have built a case on the basis of numismatics, wall painting, and poetry, particularly the poetry of Horace, for some kind of reintegration of Dionysus into the Augustan regime, and my efforts fall into that category. My main argument will be that the lines under number 1 on the handout fall short of positing an identification between Augustus and Dionysus, but that they allude to the possibility of such an identification, particularly against the historical background of Alexander Imitatio. I think that there are, so really the work that I'm doing here is I'm trying to establish how Dionysus becomes a figure that confers charisma on Augustus as leader. And I believe that there are two bases to this, both of which are concerned with power of increase. And actually, I was very interested in the discussion earlier about the relationship between ideas about Dionysus and the political uses of Dionysus in actual history rather than in philosophical discourse. And I think that I'd like to certainly use your argument about Dionysus as a figure for harmony and reconciliation after the very traumatic divisions of the decades of civil war that Augustus comes to power after. But the 2 points really are power of increase in 2 spheres. The first sphere is empire, and the second sphere is vegetation. And both of these can be substantiated separately, but they're sometimes connected. So as god of vegetation, Dionysus can make things grow, particularly the crops, but also animal life and human life, but also he makes the empire grow. Now, I want to say a few words about method. This paper is part of a larger project which will be about interpreting Virgil's references to Dionysus throughout his entire corpus. And really one thing I'd like to do is to try and reconstruct what kind of Dionysus Virgil had within his view. And that raises the methodological question of whether indeed it is possible to do that. The most captivating and persuasive studies of Dionysus, at least since Nietzsche, and we could think here of Walter Otto's book, Karl Kerenius' book, Dodds's book, Rode's book, they often look for a core essence of the god, or a series of core essences. And when we think of Dionysus in Virgil, we have to realize that all instances of Dionysus in the ancient world are actually very historically contingent, including our own. And we also have to take into consideration that Dionysus has been reconstructed in a very wide variety of ways. So to take a quotation from number 5 on the handout from Park McGinty's book, he says that interpretations of Dionysus reveal more about scholarly presuppositions than almost any other issue in classical studies. And there's a new book published in Madrid recently that takes a similar idea by Diego Merino Sanchez, called Injertando a Dioniso las interpretaciones del Dios de nuestros días a la antigüedad, with further documentation along similar lines, except including antiquity as well as modernity. Now, a second problem concerns the question of comparanda. Essentially, if you try and interpret Dionysus in Virgil on the basis of comparative evidence, you have to make a selection about what evidence you think is important. And that may involve arbitrariness, or it may involve different kinds of circular thinking, because of course by selecting some evidence you're excluding others. And how do you decide what to include? You could take your cue from Virgil. So the danger of circularity is that Virgil suggests certain comparative sources. We go to these comparative sources, we extract a construction of Dionysus from these comparative sources, and then we feed that back into Dionysus, so that back into the interpretation. So that is one possibility. Another kind of circularity, and one which I'm very willing to be guilty of, is to use earlier parts or to use different parts of Virgil's work and different versions of Dionysus in Virgil's work to interpret other versions of Dionysus in Virgil's work. So I refer here to an often cited quotation by Don Fowler, number 6 on the handout. It is simply common sense to me, for instance, that we construct our own readings of antiquity. I don't see how anyone could deny this. It sure ain't the Klingons or the Archangel Gabriel who do it for us. But in my word, construct, of course, is a whole postmodernist agenda I'm trying to con people into buying. So Fowler stages a polarized debate here between enfant terrible radicals and traditional historicizing philologists on the other hand. Now, this debate is actually quite reminiscent of the arguments between Nietzsche and Wilamowitz and others that surrounded the publication of The Birth of Tragedy. And modern classical scholarship lives with the legacy of this highly relevant debate, such that when we study Dionysus today, we may spark creative fire from the tension between ancient and modern, traditional and radical approaches to the study of the god. The most important thing, I suppose, is to be transparent about what assumptions underpin the inquiry, transparent and explicit. So across, Virgil will have been quite aware that even in antiquity, Dionysus was understood in a wide variety of ways. So we have the Orphic Dionysus, who's a child of Persephone. We have the more traditional Dionysus, who's a child of Semele. We have expressions in Cicero and Diodorus and elsewhere of the multiplicity of Dionysoi, which are available. Accordingly, across Virgil's corpus, Dionysus appears in different guises at different times. And I suppose the engine of interpretative meaning in my study, if I can use that term, is the interplay and the contrast. I won't necessarily say contradiction because I might incur the ire of Richard Seaford, but the interplay and perhaps sometimes even the contradiction between different versions of Dionysus that Virgil draws on in different parts. So sometimes he symbolizes civilization, sometimes he coheres with the sacro-idyllic bucolic landscape, sometimes he's connected with fertility, poetic inspiration, sometimes tragic madness, or a combination of tragic madness and political evil, and he frequently interacts with other divinities, whether Juno, Hercules, Apollo. Here in Anchises' speech, and I think perhaps here alone, he is connected with the idea of victory, victoriousness. With these various considerations in mind, I'd like to now return to our passage number 1, and I'm going to read Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney's posthumously published translation. This is he, whose coming you've heard foretold so often, Augustus Caesar, child of the Divine One, who will establish in Latium, in Saturn's old domain, a second golden age. He will advance his empire beyond the Garamantes and the Indians, to lands unseen beneath our constellations, beyond the sun's path through the zodiac, away where a sky-braced Atlas pivots on his shoulder the firmament, inlaid with glittering stars. Already the Caspian kingdoms and Meotia know of his coming and begin to tremble at the oracles of their gods. The waters of the Nile quail in alarm and roil through their 7 mouths. Not even Hercules pursued his labours over so much of earth's surface. Not when he stalked and shot the bronze-toed deer, silenced the boar in the woods of Erymanthus, and left the air of Lerna vibrating to his bowstring. Not Bacchus either, careering in triumph, the vine reins in his grip, driving his tiger team down the heights of Nysa. The emphasis here is on how Augustus will restore the Saturnian Golden Age in Italy and expand the empire. And in line 792, we have the name Augustus, and this is closely followed in 795 by proferet imperium. Now, etymologically minded scholars, of whom many work on Virgil, have posited connections between proferet imperium and Augustus based on the etymological origins of Augustus from augeo, augere, which points to power of increase and also has religious references through augur. And next we get the references to Hercules and Bacchus. I'm mostly going to leave Hercules to one side for this paper, except to say that in Margazata's paper from this morning, where we had the conjunction of Hercules and Bacchus, it may well be that one of the most important intertexts for Hercules and Bacchus on the Severan coinage is not simply the Thracian tradition, but also actually specifically this passage of Virgil. They're found conjoined actually as early as Book 14 of the Iliad in the Dios Apate, where when he's being seduced by Hera, in a very elegant chiastic arrangement, Zeus mentions Semele and Alcmene and their offspring, Hercules and Zeus. Hercules and Dionysus. Dionysus referred to there as charma brotoisin, a joy to mankind. And there are various other parallels that we could adduce for the Hercules-Bacchus connection. So as early as charma brotoisin, the idea of Dionysus as being connected with fertility is quite strong. So let me just see, which one do I push? And which direction do I aim it in? Thank you very much. Yeah, wonderful. It works slowly. All right. Okay. Yes. It needs human intervention. I see. Right. Okay. Yeah. Good. I'll point it at your head then. So there are various texts that we could point to substantiate the connection, very much on the level of ideas, but also on ritual, and we'll come on to that in a moment, between Dionysus and vegetal fertility. We have it in the Homeric hymn, the 7th Homeric hymn, where Dionysus makes vine tendrils grow over the ship. We have it in the Bacchae, where Dionysus makes milk and honey come out of the earth. We have it in certain of Dionysus's cult titles, such as Endendros and Dendrites, and titles like that. We have it in the presence of Iacchos at the Eleusinian Mysteries, to the extent that we reconstruct them as an agrarian cult. We have it in the Athenian phallophoria at the Great Dionysia. And not only do we have it implicitly, but we have it explicitly in certain passages, including this bit of Plutarch from his essay on Isis and Osiris, where he talks about how he was the Lord, the Lord and Master not only of wine, but of every sort of moisture. And he gives a quotation from Pindar, where we have the verb auxanoi, to exemplify Dionysus's power of increase. The Romans too hailed Dionysus as a god of fertility. There is debate among historians of archaic Italy whether a version of Bacchus predated the arrival of Dionysus on Italian soil, but certainly by the 490s BC, when the temple of Ceres Liber and Libera was dedicated in Rome, the fertility connection was quite strong, because this temple was vowed during a grain shortage that imperiled the military might of Rome. And we have a very interesting piece of evidence from Varro. I think this is on the slide. Yes, thank you. So this is Varro via St. Augustine, where we have a phallophoria. And this is basically a description of an in honestum membrum, an image of the phallus being carried around on wagons all around Italian towns and villages. And to crown it all, a mater familias, a matrona, needs to put a corona on top of this phallus. And of course, Augustine is extremely censorious about this, as if this was the height of ignominy. But he does explain it. So we have an interesting mixture here of ritual and discursive commentary on ritual, which we don't often get. But he says at the end of the passage that this was so that the fascinatio, so that the hex, as it were, be warded off from the crops, that Dionysus might be propitiated. Elsewhere, and this is on your handout, number 9, Augustine tells us that they had put Dionysus in charge of liquid seeds, and there's a discussion about how Liber was in charge of the male seed and Libera was in charge of the female seed. So that's very charming indeed. So it's quite close to what we have in Plutarch. It's not surprising that we have associations between Dionysus and fertility elsewhere in Virgil's poetry, and I won't go into it in great detail, but the metaphorics of Dionysus and of Eleusis, of Eleusinian cult, are quite strong in their associations with fertility in the Georgics. And I'd like to test out on you an example of this in number 10 on the handout. We have here one of the songs from the 9th Eclogue, and in Dryden's translation, "Why, Daphnis, dost thou search in old records to know the seasons when the stars arise? See, Caesar's lamp is lighted in the skies, the star whose rays the blushing grapes adorn, and swell the kindly ripening ears of corn. Under this influence graft the tender shoot, thy children's children shall enjoy the fruit." So we have quite an insistent emphasis here on how Caesar will preside over the crops. But Caesar is referred to as Dionian. And I'm very tempted to hear an aural echo of Dionysus in Dionian, even though it refers to Venus, through Aphrodite, the child of Dione. Anyway, you can take that or leave it. My argument doesn't depend on it, but I'd be curious to know what you think. Whatever about the Eclogues passage, I do think that the idea of Dionysus as fertility god is activated in this passage from Book 6 at the beginning of the handout, particularly in relation to the restoration of the Golden Age and the idea that the ruler must take responsibility for providing food for the people. So there's a very sort of Malthusian reality, I think, behind this. And this is the status that Augustus has in the Georgics, where in the prologue, when his divinization is envisaged, he is hailed as auctorem frugum, as well as tempestatumque potentem. Now that's the first part. The second part is the various references that are to do with Dionysus as a god of conquest. And really the earliest evidence for this are the materials that Professor Isler Karenyi was putting before us and discussing this morning of Dionysus as gigantomach. But there are two other, I suppose we might call them strands. We have the idea of Dionysus as conqueror of the East, particularly India, and also the phenomenon of Dionysus imitatio, which we get from Alexander onwards. The tradition, and we have a good example, I mean, you know, we don't have to reach back to the 6th century and to classical vase painting to get the idea of Dionysus as gigantomach. In number 12 on the handout, we have this in Horace, present in Virgil's literary culture. The idea of Dionysus as conqueror may go back as far as Euripides' Bacchae. This, at least the prologue to the Bacchae, is the earliest example that we have, lines 14 to 17, even though at least one German editor of an analytic temperament wished to obelize those lines on the grounds that they represented a Hellenistic understanding of geography. This is Albrecht Diele, but various people don't agree with him. Alexander certainly is the first historical figure for whom it is attested that he identified himself as Dionysus, and there are basically three main areas of connection between Alexander and Dionysus, and the interesting thing about them is that they're not all favorable. Dionysus is an unstable symbol even in the mythologies, the legends of Alexander. So there is the story of the Carmanian revels where Alexander was like Dionysus in his triumph, and there's the whole idea of conquest itself. Then there's the coming upon Mount Meros, this ivy-covered mountain, which is full of fertility, where they supposedly meet descendants of the original colony or plantation that Dionysus put there however many years ago. And then thirdly, we have the murder of Clytus, and various sources tell us that Dionysus, that because Alexander neglected to pour libations to Dionysus on this occasion, that Dionysus maddened him, and that the drunken killing of Clytus was a retribution for the hubris of neglect. Leaving aside this complexity, when Dionysus is taken up in Rome, there's quite a tradition. Oh yes, this is another example of fertility, the Dionysian imagery being connected with fertility that we get in the Arapakis. Next, please. When the tradition is taken up in Rome, we have various Roman generals who identify themselves in one way or another with Dionysus. And some people say that it was a response to Mithridates, king of Pontus, and this is a very large dossier. But certainly Marius, Pompey, as well as Mark Antony, possibly Julius Caesar, possibly Lucullus. And the sources, the rhetoric of the sources which gives us this information is interesting, because often it is censorious. The idea being that Antony was doing a bad thing in associating himself with Dionysus. And quite often the sources make the connection with Alexander explicit, as for example these references from Pliny on Pompey's African triumph. So it isn't an incidental association with Dionysus, it's one that plugs into the tradition of Alexander imitatio, of which there are many other manifestations, including certain kinds of hairstyle and various other things. Now, next slide, please. There were various things about Antony's Dionysian persona that probably garnered him favor, especially in the East. but it also got him into trouble, and we have a lot of evidence for this. We already have it in Plutarch in chapter 24, where we're told that, and I think this might be the next slide actually, we're told that he, the different cult titles come into play, that we have sort of beneficent and savage cult titles for Plutarch. And then, would you mind going back to the other one, please? There are various references in Dio, where this, for example, is Antony speaking to his troops before the Battle of Actium, where he rouses his troops against Antony by criticizing how he has gone native. So Dionysus is, if you like, a symbol that that Antony finds difficult to control. And again, there's more that could be said about that, but I think one of the key words here is counter-propaganda. I don't know if that word has been used yet today, but I'd like to maybe add that to the mix, and I'm sure that counter-propaganda is part of what was behind the chapter 75 of the god abandoning Antony. Okay, and may I have the next, the one after that, please? Yeah, next one as well, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with some numismatic evidence, and some of the most interesting evidence for building a case for the connection between Dionysus and Augustus is indeed numismatics. So when Antony was in the East in the late 40s and 30s, he minted these Eastern coin types, Christophoroi. They're a Dionysian coin type to the extent that they have the Kista Mystica and also the snakes. So that's a famous example of Antony with the Dionysian coin. And later, if you move to the next slide, please, we get an Augustus Christophor, where we have exactly the same thing, only we have Augustus instead of Antony, and we have some laurel added to the ivy. So laurel is one of the plants of Apollo. So it's not that Dionysus has been replaced by Apollo. That would be far too Nietzschean and far too binary and schematic. But what we have had is we have had an integration, which goes part of the way towards a reappropriation or a recuperation of some kind. Okay, next slide, please. And then in 19 BC, at around the time that Augustus, through diplomatic channels, managed to get back the Parthian standards, which had been lost by Crassus at the battle, after which his head was used as a stage prop for Pentheus, there was a series of coins minted to celebrate the return of the Parthian standards, minted by a certain moneyer called Turpilianus, and they had Dionysus on them. So just if you look at these three, where we have Augusto ob cives servatos, and then obviously the name of the moneyer, but obviously a very clear Dionysus. This one here, we have a kneeling Parthian. We know that he's Parthian because he's wearing trousers, yielding up, as it were, in a gesture of submission, the standards. And we have Signis Receptis, and then the next one, please, is very similar. That's actually the one with Signis Receptis, Kaiser ob cives servatus. So we can, I think, bring these things into the mix to argue for a connection between Dionysus and all these backgrounds in our passage in Aeneid 6. So to conclude, often when people think about Dionysus in Virgil, they think of a negative kind of Dionysian manifestation. The madness of Dido, the madness of Amata, the civic evil, the anti-Augustan tones, if you like, that these represent. But leaning on traditions, historical traditions, Hellenistic traditions, and the connection of the stewardship of the food supply, we can also interpret some of the references to Dionysus in Virgil favorably, pro-imperially, etc., etc. But the danger is that we never know what kind of Dionysus we're going to get, and the symbol is multivalent in meaning, and therefore the negative ones can reflect on the positive ones or compromise the positive ones, and vice versa. Already in Euripides' Bacchae, the god styles himself with a dualistic formulation as theos de notatos anthropoisi de piotatos, a god most terrible, but to mortals most mild. Certainly looking forward to the kind of thing that we might get at the end of Euripides' Bacchae. And my conclusion really is that I think Dionysus appealed to Virgil owing to the complexity of his symbolism, and in particular this idea that we don't know which version we're going to get, the good one or the bad one, or something in between. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's an extremely interesting speech, and which doesn't help us to understand, in fact, what means Dionysian under pen of Virgil, but help us to understand that it's a useful tool, isn't it, to define different situations, but not a very simple feature. That's surprising. I'm opening a discussion. Yes, please.
Yes, thanks. What we have then is a Dionysus who is already very complex, and indeed who does involve contradiction. And we have a Dionysus who is already very complex and does indeed involve contradictions, which is then brought into a historical period in which enemies are both are wanting to claim, as anybody would, the patronage of the god. I mean, nobody could be simply anti-Dionysus. And this sets up then this highly complex series of reactions. And what we get is what you might expect, actually. I mean, so that if Antony is a problem for Augustus in his association with Dionysus, I mean, that's because Augustus can't simply be, nobody can be simply anti-Dionysus. You can't be anti a great god, even though that god has been appropriated by your enemy. So other strategies are involved, and they may not be even explicitly formulated. They will just emerge. Now, to be sure, that passage in Plutarch where he's called both mild and very cruel, is it agriotitos or yes, I mean, that has a long history, that word, actually, for Dionysus. And there's even a Theban festival, the Agrionia, which is but this is a sort of fascinating point, because you quoted that bit of the Bacchus, where he is both terrible and mild. And it looks as if the bit of Plutarch may be influenced by that, or influenced by that tradition. Actually, you slightly misquoted it, because I think you left out the word entele. Actually, because that's very...
I wondered whether you'd pick up on that.
That's very... I mean, I don't blame you for leaving it out, because people generally think they don't know what it means. But it is an absolutely crucial line of the Bacchus, and it's been prized by so many people as somehow bringing us to the heart of the god. So you have the god who is entele de notatos, anthropoisi de apiotatos, right? So what does entele mean? In authority, the most terrible, but to human beings in general, most mild. And that doesn't make any sense at all. My interpretation is actually very simple, and in my view actually makes perfect sense of entele. It's the only one that does. Telos can mean an initiation ritual, right? And there are examples of it. Telos means an initiation. It can mean many other things as well, but it means an initiation ritual. And Dionysus, of course, is denotatos entele. He's denotatos in the initiation ritual, because that's secret. It's all this terrible stuff that he does are the sufferings of the initiate in the negative phase of initiation, the sufferings of death, dismemberment, and so on. And moreover, that makes perfect sense of entele. Moreover, of course, it is antithetical to anthropoisi, because anthropoisi means to people in general, the uninitiated, the initiated, everybody. So I've no doubt that that's what that phrase means. And of course, what you find then, that just as it's taken by certain people to be a kind of contradiction out of context, just a contradiction, it can be used politically then by the enemies of Antony, that idea to, as it were, make sense of the fact that he has this relationship with the god, which is very difficult for his opponents to handle. I would have thought that the most effective way of doing it is precisely what you get in Plutarch, with the passage Filip talked about, in which you say, well, actually the god left Antony. Now, I don't know whether, I haven't read the literature on that passage, but to me the whole point of it is not the sort of Cavafian pathos that you get, which is our instinctive reaction to it. It's such a poetic scene. But how do you deal with the fact that this terrible man Antony has this close relationship with Dionysus? You say, well, there was a point at which the god decided to leave him. The god was fed up with him, and so he goes off to the camp of Augustus instead. It looks to me just like political propaganda in origin. I don't mean in Plutarch, but I mean in origin. Because as far as I know, and I'm not an ancient historian, the Greeks and Romans didn't go about trying to tempt the gods of the other side to join them. They did do that in Mesopotamia. For example, if you lay siege to a city, you spend much of your time trying to get the gods of the city to leave, come out from the city through the gates and join you. You know, that happened in Mesopotamia. So far as I know, and I might be completely wrong about this, that sort of thing didn't happen so much. I don't remember it in Thucydides probably wouldn't comment on it anyway, but Herodotus and Polybius and so on. So it's not a particularly Greco-Roman thing to do. It's more an ancient Near Eastern thing to do. But of course there may be examples. But in this situation, it's done not so that you win the Battle of Actium. It's done so you handle the association of Antony with Dionysus.
There is the Roman tradition of evocatio.
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And then also, I'm not sure whether that word has been used in the literature on this passage. It may have been, but it should be.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. Of course, it's not itself an evocatio, but it shows. Yeah, you're right.
No, but it could reflect the tradition of the evocatio. But the other interesting thing about that passage is it's leaving Alexandria. It's not actually before, but it's actually after Antony has lost the Battle of Actium. So you could argue that it's because Antony is such a loser that the god has abandoned him. Incidentally, there's also a Leonard Cohen song. You were talking about the Cavafian pathos. There's a Leonard Cohen song, Alexandra Leaving, which is a breakup song, which puts a completely different spin on leaving Alexandria.
Yes, in many ways. I mean, the fact that it's after the battle kind of dissociates it from the mindset of evocatio, doesn't it? There's something else going on, which I think is the propaganda.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Filip Doroszewski.
So Fiachra, I'm sorry, you told us that we are not sure what Dionysus is in Virgil, but what do you think about those scholars who say that a very important intertext for Aeneid is actually the Bacchae? I mean, that at least the first part of Virgil's Aeneid follows the narrative of the Bacchae, meaning that Aeneas is a sort of Dionysiac agent. I mean, he comes and he is rejected and he fights and he triumphs and so on and so on. Yeah.
I think that I agree with, and indeed I have agreed in print with that view of reading the Aeneid. And interestingly, you can see it linking up with other aspects of the Aeneid that are not particularly Dionysian, tragic intertextuality more broadly. I suppose that I'm not trying to say that any one interpretation is wrong, although if I thought something was wrong, I would say so. Rather that I think that different strategies and manifestations of Dionysus can coexist. So I don't think the existence of the Dionysus one, of Euripides' Bacchae as a sort of a literary background for the Aeneid necessarily rules out any of the others. In fact, if anything, it makes them more likely. But just going back to what I was saying earlier in response to Richard Seaford's paper, if you read the second half of the Aeneid as a kind of Bacchae, you can read Amata as a kind of Agawa figure, Turnus as a kind of Pentheus figure, and indeed even the name Turnus, again to the etymologist, has suggested Tyrannos, and Aeneas as a Dionysian figure. And it is possible to read the sacrificial killing of, the pervertedly sacrificial killing of Turnus at the end of the Aeneid, where Aeneas uses the word immolat, and even his greatest supporters are a little bit cagey about his use of the word immolat there, because the sacrificial language doesn't belong. Orthopraxy is not being observed more broadly, but we can read this against the sacrificial killing of Pentheus, and then that gets us into this debate about how should the killing of Pentheus make us feel versus how should the killing of Turnus make us feel. And it really goes back to the discussion that we were having earlier about whether the end of the Bacchae is celebratory or not, or whether the end of the Aeneid is celebratory or not. Do we have here the triumphant victory of the Trojans over the Italians, or do we instead have something more complex that may involve that, but that might also involve a generous perspective on the pathos of the loser? And I think this is something that we have in the Bacchae as well, that even if you think that on balance that Dionysus needs to win, and that it's great that we now are going to have communal festivities and the establishment of the rites and the festival, it's very hard to erase the pain of the death of Pentheus, and that's one of the reasons we're still reading the play, because it has this complexity in it that is appealing to sensibilities throughout the ages. So I think that even the Euripidean intertextuality in the Aeneid is something that can be read in at least two ways.
Although 25 minutes, it's still not tragedy. We are late 25 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, please, last question now for Fiachra. If not, thank you very much again. Let me now say a word about last speaker today, David Fernández de la Fuente. David is a professor at the Department of Classics at Universitat Complutense, Madrid. He has taught also at University Carlos III, Madrid, and University of Potsdam in Germany. He published a lot, but I would like to say a word, what's not a common thing, that he has also published for novels, and he was awarded 2 prizes of literature for contemporary fiction. I know your books on Ariana, but I didn't know that. David will deliver us a paper on Dionysus in the Mirror of Late Antiquity, from religion to politics.
So thanks a lot for the kind invitation and for the presentation. I'd like to start with this famous Roman sarcophagus of Ariadne, and at the Louvre Museum, because I will be speaking of the importance of the Dionysus, this as Jamer has put it, a politic god. No? This is the beginning of our discussion. No? To which extent, to what an extent Dionysus was misunderstood by modern criticism in this integration with the polis. No? And I will try to show a panorama of Dionysus in late antiquity, what he means, and how in the last pagan generation, to become a Dionysus, to become Bacchus, was still very relevant in the light of the Platonic tradition, and how in this time, from the 4th to the 6th century, up to the end of the new academy, with the decree of Justinian, it was still very relevant for Neoplatonic philosophy in 3 main spheres. I would say metaphysics sphere, an ethic sphere also, and as well in a political way, no? Which is also the purpose of this conference. My title is, yes, from religion to politics, but I think philosophy is in the middle of the way. So we will have to deal with philosophy at the beginning, and then we will see if it makes any sense. No? The question of how to integrate the otherness in the polis has been addressed already in this conference, and has created a big amount of perplexity in scholars. Jan was an example, how this otherness can be a model for a ruler. This is one of the basic questions in archaic and classical polis, no? Which is solved soon with the example of Alexander the Great, using both Hercules and Dionysus as a political model of ruler, conqueror, etc., as Nock in a 1928 article already studied, no? Notes on rulers' cults. But in this way, I will try to show also, we have seen some Neoi Dionysoi, some new Dionysus. I would like to focus on the late antique ruler. And so I will be following this three-party structure. First, see what Dionysus meant in late antiquity, still for the lower classes, for the agrarian cult. Secondly, what it meant for the intellectuals, especially for the Neoplatonic school. And third, what can we say politically about Dionysus? Well, among all the gods of ancient religion that stood out in the syncretic theology of late antiquity, Dionysus became the clearest example of the figure of God, the Son of God, a savior figure who mediated between both worlds. This god of many functions and invocations will have a final resurgence in late antiquity, as he goes through a twofold transformation. On the one hand, his figure will be a symbol of power, like that of Rome itself, after Alexander, of course, civilizes the barbarians and gives them a type of Pax Dionysiaca. On the other hand, Dionysus will be modeled with greater emphasis as a god of individual salvation, and hence this sarcophagus of Ariadne, especially due to his connections with the mysteries, and with an evident comparison with Christ. Of course, the Christian intertext is always we have to be aware of this all the time. No? And in the political discourse of late antiquity, of course, we are not speaking about the polis with participation of the citizens. This is a very different atmosphere. I would like to use a category of modern political thought, contemporary political thought, established by Carl Schmitt, the idea of the politic and the politics. No? In late antiquity, we will see that Dionysus is still present, both in das Politische, so the interaction between factions. In this case, Christians are there, and Crassus and alter Bacchus, no, in a way, and in the politics, also in the institutionalized empire, because some of the rulers of the last pagan rulers, no, I will be speaking of the Tetrarchy of Galerius, of course, will identify themselves with Dionysus as a soter, but also in this new tripartite sense. No? This new Dionysus is halfway between a religious and a political figure, as we will see. The vision of the god is connected to his Neoplatonic interpretation, key to the mythical allegories with which this philosophical school, the true ideological engine of late antiquity, symbolized divine knowledge, but also individual salvation and also ideal rule of an empire. As the scholars of the Dionysian cult during late antiquity have pointed out, this Dionysus plays an important role in the henotheistic tendency of paganism that began to be accentuated around the 3rd century already, and according to which this ancient god of vegetation came to occupy almost exclusively a conceptual space related to these three spheres. Redemption, salvation, but also a kind of son of God the Father, no? Of the main God, and heir to his throne, according to the Orphic myth of Zagreus. This will be clear. This will be in clear concurrence with other gods, And after the process of the evolution of paganism, Dionysus will compete directly with Christ. Indeed, the cult of Dionysus is one of the most entrenched and persistent in the system of classical paganism. For the 4th century, the presence of paganism in the public sphere gradually decreases, and yet the literary sources refer to the vigor of Dionysus' cult during the first years of the Christian Empire. We see an example even under Emperor Valens. At his time, there was a Dionysian cult in Antioch, a bastion city of the new Christian religion, and it seems that the emperor himself, who was there in 370 in this decade, he was more concerned about the Nicene-Arian controversy, and he granted relative freedom to the pagans of the city, allowing them to celebrate the ritual of Dionysus, among other gods. The ecclesiastical historian Theoret is scandalized, and I quote, no, "The initiate in the rites of Dionysus ran with goat skins, tearing the dogs to pieces, and insane, they went into ecstasy." This is not possible anymore. This situation lasted until the edict of Theodosius against paganism in 392. But there are many testimonies, many sources telling of this persistence of the cult of Dionysus. For example, Christian historian Sozomen also refers to the punishment of 2 Christian clerics of Laodicea for having recited certain Bacchus verses only for the initiated. And in the Latin West, Augustine of Hippo recalls in one of his epistles the familiarity of his urban environment with the rites and festivity in honor of Dionysus, which were very persistent still in the countryside. The lower strata of the population persisted in the veneration of Dionysus, focusing his salvific side, and also in the agrarian connection, of course. Nevertheless, the intellectuals of the time also followed him closely, considering him a god with an important role in the philosophical arena. The Epitaph, I would like to give 2 examples of lower strata and higher strata of the society. There's a humble grave, an epitaph from late antiquity, quoted by Brown, Teber, and Vane, saying that the deceased was, I quote, snatched by Bacchus in order to become his initiate and companion. No? In the funerary iconography, not only sarcophagus, but vases and sculpture, etc., Dionysus and Ariadne are everywhere. But on the other hand, we know from the Byzantine Suidas lexicon that another deceased called Hercules, a learned pagan from an educated family of 5th century Egypt, was mummified and then became Bacchus. So what does it mean to become a Bacchus in this time? No? He was a member of the family of Apollon, a very influential pagan family of late antique Egypt, from the 4th to the 5th century. And he was related also to the last pagan riots in Alexandria, no? The one of 486. There was this poet Pamperpis of Panopolis who went to the capital, to Constantinople, and was in the middle of this last attempt, last pagan chance of political survival, let's say. No, it's very interesting because he was at the same time as a riot in Alexandria. No? He was dead he died in a fortress of Papirion besieged by Emperor Zeno. But it was so to speak, the last chance, no, in this generation. But this generation is key, in my view, and still in 6th century Syrian Egypt, there will be a cult of Dionysus in many different social strata, even as late as the 7th century at the Council of Constantinople, Justinian II wanting to include an explicit condemnation with threat of excommunication for those who invoked, I quote, the name of the execrable Dionysus. No? Well, this is, we must ask ourselves what it means to become a Dionysus in this time. No? We know from Plato's free truths that many are the Thyrsus bearers, but few the Bacchoi, that to become a Bacchus was a very deeply rooted leitmotif in Platonic philosophy. But it's especially interesting to see how the pagan intellectuals from Neoplatonism interpreted this idea of becoming a Dionysus and what Dionysus meant for them. I will show a mirror. The mirror of Dionysus. Why the mirror of Dionysus? Huh? Yes, it works. as Dionysian magic, maybe. Well, why a mirror? Well, Dionysus appears as a symbol of alternation, second hypostasis, soul of the world, mediator in contact between the intellectual and the sensible world. The place of the second hypostasis, that of the Logos, is evidently also for Christ. But for pagan henotheism in late antiquity, Dionysus is par excellence the sun god. There is even a famous quotation by Macrobius saying that this god is in two phases, no? Underground or celestial. Celestial is Apollon, Phoebus, and underground is Dionysus. No? It was an old leitmotif also of philosophy. It appears already in Heraclitus, no? This connection with the Hades. But the emphasis on the philosophical interpretation of Dionysus came from an ancient tradition on the Platonic Academy. We have addressed already in the discussions the importance of Plato's laws and the rules of the symposium there. The Middle and the New Academy developed these ideas, no? Which are in the Phaedrus, in the Symposium, with Dionysus as a symposiarch, and inspiration also of this mystical way of the initiate towards ascent to the good. But also in Plutarch, of course, with whom we have seen here some of his Dionysian interest in myths and allegories, etc. But the interpretation of Dionysus is especially relevant from Plotinus onward. The idea is that, Dionysus is a kind of bridge between the two worlds. And we must especially mention the myth of Dionysus Zagreus, the Orphic myth of Dionysus. His death and his, as you know, this is politically very relevant because even during his childhood, as a Urkind, as a Wunderkind, he was the one chosen by Zeus to be his successor on the throne of the universe. It has a political relevance. However, this succession is, as it happened so many times in the reality of the Roman Empire, would be frustrated by a conspiracy. The child Dionysus is deceived by the Titans at the behest of the jealous Hera. The Titans dupe him with children toys and, among other things, with a mirror in which he remains looking at his reflection enraptured. Taking advantage of his carelessness, the Titans kill him, tear him apart, and eat him. And the myth has interesting endings. The second Dionysus, that of the Theban myth, will emerge from his salvaged heart. The Titans are killed by an enraged Zeus with his thunderbolt, and from their ashes humanity will emerge, evil from the god's perspective, but partially divine from having participated in the horrible banquet of the gold child. This myth was used not only as a symbolic narration of the fate of the soul, but also as a metaphysical allegory of the transition between unity and multiplicity, the intelligible and the sensible, the indivisible and the divisible, reality and its reflection, hence the mirror. The Zagreus myth, probably based on an ancient history of the Orphic ritual, provided this late antique Dionysus with a deeply eschatological and soteriological dimension within the framework of the mystery religions, which would be decisive for its Neoplatonic reworking. Neoplatonisms were very interested in this idea, or in the idea of the mirror, and they, with the mirror and the reflection of Dionysus, explain allegorically the process of the soul at the crossroad of the intelligible and the sensible world, and its transition between the one and the many. I quote Plotinus. He says in the first Ennead, the souls of men see their images as if they were in the mirror of Dionysus, and they happen to be on that level by jumping from above, but they are not torn from their own principle and intellect. End of quotation. There's another famous myth of reflection in the mirror, that of Narcissus, that Plotinus uses as well, but Narcissus is a man. It's about the destiny of human soul. Dionysus is a god, and he's used to express also a Neoplatonic cosmology, and even cosmogony, how our material world is created. The dismemberment of Zagreus appears in other authors. For example, in Macrobius, commentary on the dream of Scipio, he alludes also to the mirror that appears in this myth as the reflection of the intelligible over matter. And it's very especially relevant for Proclus. In Proclus' system, this emblematic episode will have a determining cosmological aspect. In this system, Dionysus works as a child god of the wonderful, the wonderful child, who is able to give rise to the cosmos. For Proclus, child Dionysus appears as an allegory of the cosmic intelligence, Dios nous, no? The nous of God, of God the Father, no? And also a symbol of the ability of the universe to be filled with the intellect. And the intellect is the undivided substance of Dionysus, which has been torn apart in a multiplicity of fragments by the action of Zeus, of the Titan. Sorry. Later on, Proclus interprets the rebirth of Dionysus from the tide of Zeus and its subsequent care by the Norse Hypta as the reception of the intelligible forms by the soul of the war. Dionysus in the mirror is then the god that allows human souls in a certain way to participate in their own mysterious, sacrificial, and cosmogonic experience in desiring to descend to the created universe. But secondly, I would like to stress the ethical perspective, because for Proclus, Dionysus also embodies the divine part in the human being, as a consequence of the Orphic myth. I quote Proclus, "The intellect in us is Dionysian, and is a true agalma of God." He used the word agalma, divine statue, not icon. No? There was this Neoplatonic fantasia and the debate on perception, and well, mirroring was a favorite metaphor for fantasia, already from Plato, Theaetetus, and Aristotle, the anima, and it was taken by the Neoplatonists also to develop the idea of how our soul, our mortal soul, can comprehend some of this divine work. No? So the intellect is Dionysian; it's a kind of statue of the god within. No? Other thinkers like Olympiodorus and Damascius also refer to the myth of this of Sagrus in a philosophical manner. I will leave this for the written version of the paper because I fear being too long. But the idea is, well, in short, no? Olympiodorus comments on Plato's Phaedrus and claims that those who are called Bacchus, that becomes Bacchus, are really the philosophers who have lived in a contemplative and just way. And in his commentary to the passage, he said that only someone who leads such a life can become a Bacchus, since, I quote, "we are changed to matter like the Titans by extreme partition in a world in which mine and yours prevail, but we are resurrected like Bacchus. Therefore, we become more receptive to the gift of prophecy as death approaches us." No? This is a classical theme. No? And Dionysus is the pattern of death because he is the pattern of ecstasy in any form. End of quotation. No? Damascius, on his side, interprets the creating action of Dionysus as possessing a double function that again is reflected both on the metaphysical and ethical levels. Fulfilling the mediating function attributed to it by tradition, Dionysus helps the sensible world to participate in the intellect, while the Titans represent the bonds that unite the soul to the body. The Dionysian life is then an aesthesis in this world for the philosopher, who prepares through this ritualization that imitates the myth for the other reality. Well, this is an idea that Damascius works on also with the leitmotif of Ariadne, who is, by the way, in this mirror, this Hellenistic mirror, with his savior Dionysus, no? Ariadne as the soul, no? Which appears often in the Neoplatonic text. This interpretation of the double life of Ariadne, the thread and how we can guide ourselves in this world, and the salvation of the soul. Dionysus and his experience of dismemberment not only made him as God, the closest to the man, but also enabled the divinization of his acolytes, such as Ariadne. No? We can say that in Dionysus we see not only the traditional interpretation of myth in an allegorical way that harmonizes the poetic wisdom of old paganism with the Platonic and Neoplatonic postulates, but also through the concrete religious practices of late antiquity. This is demonstrated by theurgy, or the remains of the Bacchic cult that we have in the literary sources, and for example, in the funerary perspectives. No? The idea that they can still be mummified or buried and become a Dionysus in this epitaph of low social class. I asked myself to which extent the Dionysian mystery was still alive in rural areas, for example, of Syria and Egypt. No? Probably they were very alive. No? Around the city of Pan, no? Panopolis, where a famous school of poetry of Nonnos and his Dionysiaca is based. No? But at the same time, in the Neoplatonic schools of Syria, Athens, Alexandria, there was an intellectualization of the gods, no? Which is what I try to say. Thus, it is not surprising that at the beginning of the 6th century and before being banished by Justinian, Damascius, this last scholar of the academy I just quote, wrote the following word, I quote, "When a man leads a Dionysian life, his problems are already solved and he's freed from his bonds and freed from custody, or rather from the confined form of life. That man is the philosopher in the purification stage." Indeed, at the end of paganism, Dionysus appears as a new religious philosophical model of an old Platonic Pythagorean ideal, that of the homoiosis theo, no? The assimilation with the god, the following akoluthein to theo, etc. No? Damascius, who also discussed Greek myth in allegorical sense, wrote commentaries on Plato's Phaedrus, so this is a key dialogue for this idea. No? But thirdly, I'd like to go into politics. I don't know if I have time or
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Oh, okay, I'll try to speed up a little bit. Okay. That was the most interesting part. But anyway, you will read it in the. I'm sorry because I'm the last one and I should be brief. But what happens in brief with politics? We know all these precedents of the Neoi, Dionysoi, Ptolemies, Mark Antony, up to Septimius Severus, and so on. Of course, the Neoplatonic school, in contrary to what is generally thought, had a direct political influence. There's a great book by Omeara, Platonopolis, who Omeara shows how influential it was. We know that Plotinus followed Gordian to Persia in search of Oriental wisdom. He wanted to go to India. He came back to Rome. He was in good relation with the emperor, Philip the Arab, Gallienus, etc., etc. And Porphyry apparently had a very active role as an intellectual supporter of the persecution of the Christians. This is a very interesting theory. Under the rule of emperors Diocletian and Galerius. It is disputed whether he is the pagan priest of the philosophers quoted by Lactantius, but it's quite likely, no? It's of the same time. So we must rethink the role of Neoplatonism in this, in politics, no? in the Politik, not only in Das Politische, following Schmidt, no? As an ideological basis for the late Roman rulers who still were pagans. No? The comparison with Christ is there, but we cannot go into this. No? Moreover, the Neoplatonical political model also appears in Diocletian tetrarchy. This is a very interesting theory. No? Not only the support of Porphyry to the anti-Christian agenda, but also the support for this quadruple figure of emperors protected by pagan deities. From Zeus, Hercules. Well, there is Dionysus as well. No, we have Galerius. I brought some images of late antique Dionysus. This one is a very famous mosaic, 4th century near Paphos in Cyprus, showing Dionysus being adored just as a baby Jesus, no, with a manum velatio of Hermes. Is quite very well explained by a Polish archaeologist. I don't remember the name, but yeah. And here is another mosaic with fight with the Indians, no? But the iconography of Dionysus for Galerius is omnipresent. It's everywhere. In the villae of the Tetrarchy, there's a strong presence in Sicily, for example, of Galerius. And Galerius made himself a palace in. This is an ivory casket in London, no? With of the 6th century, very late, with the campaign against the Indian. But Galerius built himself a great big palace in nowadays Serbia, Felix Romuliana Gamsigrat, with whose iconographic program was all about Dionysus. No? Also in Thessaloniki, there was some Dionysian mosaics from this time, which is very, very, very interesting also. And Lactantius, great enemy of Galerius, as evil persecutor of the Christians, criticized the myths of Liber, and the connection with Galerius is more than evident, as Nicholson, in a paper of 1984, has convincingly showed, in my view, no? The divine patronage of Dionysus. No? So, by way of conclusion, if you allow me, on the philosophical level, it can be properly justified that Dionysus would be the patron god of a ruler placed in the background after Zeus, since Dionysus Sacrus is heir to the divine throne. In addition, Dionysus joins these three spheres, metaphysics, ethics, and politics, and now we can try to guess what it means to become a Dionysus in late antiquity in this transversal way. No? Dionysus is also the god of philosophical divinization, yes, as the Neoplatonic philosophers show, also individual salvation, as the funerary tradition show, but also there is a kind of political divinization which is very interesting, and it was studied by Omiara, on his text on political life and divinization in Neoplatonism. The idea of homoiousis theo for the philosopher goes beyond, and there is a reception of the Theaetetus and of Plato, an interesting, very interesting comparison with the Enneads, where the political virtues are described as inspired by divine models. This can be also related to the emphasis of Neoplatonism in the contemplative life, following a sage like Pythagoras, etc., and the political leadership of these figures of holy men, of the Neoi, Andres, of both religion and politics. No? The very Pythagoras was like that, no? And Iamblichus and Porphyry are very keen on emphasizing also the political nuances of this community, of this ideal community. Proclus, in the case of Proclus, the political model of Neoplatonism is more evident. Neoplatonic hypostasis, the three levels of descending reality that already appeared in Plotinus, also represent for him models for the three levels of political reform. Proclus identifies them as Zeus, Dionysus, and Adonis, no? In a descending way. The second place is always for Dionysus, as Galerius is only second to Diocletian. In the one, the Henads, and the intelligible reality, with three types of demiurges that correspond, according to his commentary on the Timaeus, with three types of government. Without delving into the complex details of this system of demiurges, the importance of Dionysus is hard to be underestimated here. No, is observed here as he placed him in the second place after the supreme god, in a way that could interest the tetrarchy system and the deification of the ruler. In addition, it had at the same time the already mentioned background of Dionysus as a divine part of the soul, and it was a long Platonic tradition. To sum up, as we can see, whether as a ruler or as a philosopher, Dionysus appears as a powerful symbol that permeates, thanks to the henotheistic and Neoplatonic interpretation, various ideological levels in late antiquity. Thank you.
No. Thank you very much, David, for your incredibly wide and detailed this landscape of late antiquity Dionysus. It reminds me the sentence taken from book of Precious in the last chapter of your Dionysus is information that Dionysian religion, if we can say so, was the biggest competitor to Christianity. And that what David shows in fact incredibly rooted in the ancient reality and very multi-aspectual presence of Dionysus. It would be very interesting to hear your opinion, maybe on the end of a discussion, not to start to. I mean, why Dionysus? That's interesting. I mean, why Dionysus played so important? Why is it Dionysus that it played so important role among so many different gods, of so many features, of so many teletais, of so many extremely deep theological examination made by philosophers, poets, etc. Why Dionysus? It's so important that it focused attention of a late antiquity to that level. So that's the, let's say, last question of the discussion. And now, if you would like to ask our speaker, please do so. Professor Karen.
Oui, merci. Merci, je parle français. Une petite essai de réponse à votre question. Pourquoi Dionysos? On ne l'a pas dit aujourd'hui, mais c'est une chose que tout le monde sait, le fait que Dionysos est le seul enfant légitime de Zeus, parce qu'il est le seul qui est sorti d'une grossesse paternelle outre que maternelle. Donc il y a il est le plus légitimé parmi les successeurs possibles de Zeus.
So everyone are part of the sisters of Semele. I would say believe on that. Of course, I mean that's a joke. Yeah. Professor Seaford, please. Would you like to pass the microphone?
Well, one factor in the popularity of Dionysus, which we haven't really mentioned or not very much, is mystery cult, which was Dionysiac mystery cult was clearly, we know from inscriptions and texts and visual evidence, very important in antiquity, in late antiquity, in early Christian antiquity, so that Clement of Alexandria has to attack it and say that Jesus is the real mysterion. And it's popular because it deals with death. I mean, mystery cult is a rehearsal of death in order to remove the fear of death. That is going to be popular, and that is therefore something which Christianity has to take on and defeat, either by suppressing it or by using its vocabulary in the Christian message, which does both of those things. So, but that, of course, mystery cult isn't the only feature of Dionysus. You also have the popularity of Dionysus in agricultural activity, in drinking, and so on. But mystery cult is far more important than one might initially suppose, because, of course, it was secret. It was not to be revealed. But nevertheless, we can uncover it in many different ways. And but of course, mystery cult is important to go to the talk we've just heard in understanding Plato and Plotinus, because both those philosophers, and indeed many other philosophers, do something a bit similar to what the Christians do. They say, well, this is the real mystery, is philosophy. And they use the vocabulary, as Plato does, as Plotinus does, of mystery cult. So there's a connection with Dionysus. Dionysus is not the only mysteries, you also have Eleusinian mysteries. But then there are other Dionysuses, the Dionysus the Conqueror, the Dionysus the god of the whole people, and so on. I'm rather doubtful, certainly, that Plotinus has any political consequence. I mean, to be sure, there was a plan to set up a Platonopolis, which was simply a community of philosophers. It had no serious political significance beyond that, and of course it didn't even happen. Plotinus knows wealthy people. In fact, he needs to know wealthy people because he needs to be supported, and we know that. But I don't see anything in the Enneads. There is some discussion of justice, of course, but there's no political program there. I mean, the contrast with the great master Plato is total. This is a philosophy that has retreated into salvational metaphysics, a psychology of salvation, and so on. I don't think that we can call Plotinus significantly political, the least political in a sense of all philosophers. That doesn't mean, of course, that Dionysiac cult doesn't retain its political significance. And anyway, I'll stop there because I'm simply reacting to different things in what you've said.
Thanks a lot for your remarks.
Would you like to answer now?
Yeah, okay.
Or
I don't know.
Maybe
Anyone
yes,
who-
yes, please.
Well, regarding mystery cults, I think this is very interesting what happens in late antiquity with the mysteries, because we see that they are still practiced in a way, on a level, on a popular level, but they are philosophized on another level. Of course, they follow this Platonic tradition of that the true mysteries are philosophy, and they are at the same time, feared by the Christians, because they see, I mean, there is a Christian kind of rivalry from very early. We can also read the Gospel of John as a reference to the true vine, the false wine. There was a cult of Dionysus in Palestine, and from the Hellenistic times. No? And it's very interesting how that interacts with Christianity and Dionysus. No? I was going to there and write something, but I didn't. Proclus politics and Arianism. That should be studied, because this last, I mean, it's true that Plotinus, answer to the second question, has no explicit political agenda there. It speaks about political virtues, but very, well, we have to remember also that Plotinus was used in a way by his pupil Porphyry, who wrote extensively on him, biography, and collected all the. So he was beyond that, no? He was like the godlike sage and master, and probably had no clear, explicit political agenda, no? Unlike the other philosophers, no? We have to we must remember, for example, not only Proclus and in the Platonic school of Athens, but also in Alexandria, the Hypatia case, who is in the, there's a new book of Edward Watts about that, is in the middle of the political debate. No, I was going to say that, yeah, I mean, these Proclean politics have a lot to do with trying to reconcile the idea of a divine ruler with a monos theos, no? That would have worked with Arianism, a kind of second hypostasis. That's why the figure of Dionysus is so interesting in Proclus as the model of the second kind of government, no? But yeah, but still, it's true that for Plotinus, the main interest of Dionysus is both metaphysics and ethics. I mean, for the individual salvation, I would say, as a metaphor also for the differentiation of matter. Well, yes, that's my point. No, my point was regarding Plotinus, his relation with the power is very, very close, no? And the Neoplatonic school has quite successfully manages to be close to the power until the very end. Well, Hypatia is probably the last example of a philosopher who had in her inner circle all the powerful men of the town, prefects, magistri militum, etc., were a member of this school, and probably was an attempt of reconciling this Neoplatonic tradition with a new Christian audience, which failed evidently, no? But so that's a little sort of answer to this. No? I don't know.
So I think this is the end of a discussion. Thank you, David, again. Thank you very much for your excellent statement. And I ask Filip again for an official ending of our conference.
Well, dear speakers, dear guests, our conference, or at least its official part, is coming to an end, but not our discussion on Dionysus and politics. On the contrary, I hope that a new and serious discussion will follow, and the first step of this discussion will be our volume, the proceedings, I mean. Then we will see, who knows. Anyway, we would like you to be the part of this further discussion about Dionysus and politics. And while awaiting for this future for these future things to come, I would like to thank you all for your participation in this conference. Our special thanks go to our keynote speakers, Professor Isler Kereni. Thank you very much, Professor Richard Seaford. Thanks a lot for having accepted our invitation and for sharing your ideas with us. I would like to thank to all other speakers as well, to all other guests. And I think that we should also thank the authorities of the College of Europe for their hospitality. I think that this beautiful place, this beautiful setting, made this conference so much more enjoyable. So thank you very much once again, and the dinner is awaiting us. Let's go there. Thank you.